good. You sound good.
I assume it'll work like most of the other ones. I have a kind of presentation to run through once we get going.
Yep, sounds good.
Cool.
Okay, I think we're ready to go. Carrie, could you just wait, let me just do a quick check of counselors to see if I have. Okay, so I'm not sure in terms of who arrived after Ed between Kenzie and Liz. So if someone has insight, if you could bump it in the chat, that would be much appreciated.
I'll defer to Counselor Breeden.
Okay, thank you, Kenzie. Okay, so I think we're ready to go then. Carrie, just let me know when.
Will do, thank you. We're all set and ready to roll.
Okay, great. All right, so we'll gavel in with my cup. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Boston City Council's Committee on Post-Audit and Oversight. We are here for a hearing on docket number 0621, order for a hearing regarding all city department FY20 budget surpluses. This matter was sponsored by Councilor Michael Flaherty and referred to this committee. I'm joined by several colleagues, and they will have a chance to give an opening statement and later ask questions in the order of their virtual arrival. First, the sponsor, Councilor Michael Flaherty, then District 2 Councilor Ed Flynn. Then I'm told it was a close, but by a hair, it was Councilor Liz Braden, District 9, and then Councilor Kenzie Bach, District 8. Oh, and also I see we're also joined by at-large Councilor Anissa Asabi George. So just a few reminders, which I've been missing lately because I had not been printing this out prior, and usually it's right on our desk. So today I do want to remind everyone that this is a public hearing being recorded and broadcast on Comcast 8, RCN 82, and Verizon 1964 at a later date. It's currently being streamed on the City of Boston, the City Council's YouTube channel. We will take public testimony at the end of the hearing. If you are interested in testifying, please email ron.cobb, that's ron.cobb @boston.gov for the link, and follow along on the live stream to know when it's your turn to speak. Good, okay, so we already put the docket number on the record. We'll hear later from several representatives from the administration. I want to thank everyone for their time amidst a very busy time for the City of Boston. So we'll begin with opening statements from councilors, starting with the sponsor, Councilor Michael Flaherty. Hold on, Councilor, let me try to make sure you're unmuted. I'm having some trouble unmuting you.
My apologies, you have it there.
There you go. Yep.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Councilor Wu, for chairing this timely hearing. And thank you to my colleagues who are joining us, as well as I see Justin Starett from the administration. So good afternoon, Justin. We're approaching the end of the fourth quarter, and some city departments may have budget surpluses, given that a lot of folks have been working from home, and there's been arguably a shutdown, if you will. So curious to see what, if any, funds are available that could be redirected to our COVID response efforts, particularly as it relates to public health emergency folks, healthcare personnel, first responders, and or other city departments that have been playing a critical role in our COVID-19 response. So in my hearing order, I highlighted the city's annual budget allocation of $24,788,143 for snow removal as one example, as one city budget item that may have a surplus, given that we didn't have a lot of snow this year. That said, despite the fact that we had no snow emergencies this past winter, the Public Works Department, based on our last couple of hearings, have continued to work extremely hard throughout the crisis. All those employees have been helping throw a shoulder into the COVID-19 response. So while they're providing essential services, during COVID-19 pandemic, the resources may be flowing there, which is why obviously we're having this conversation. I know that they're working hard to keep our streets clean. They're attending to many things, helping get the food distribution out there, also using their buying power to purchase supplies for the COVID-19 effort. So there's a number of things that Public Works and other departments are actively involved with as part of our response. So I put the blanket out there that I know that each of our departments is working very hard and contributing efforts. We're on the phone, as you know, Justin, every single day with the mayor and his team. So we know the efforts that are undertaken right now. Obviously those efforts are requiring resources as well. It may be repositioning, it may be repurposing. End of the day, as the municipal branch of city government and as the sort of having the fiduciary responsibility, those are things that the council should be involved with, or at least be granting allocation authority for. So I'm confident in you and your ability and in your efforts during this COVID response as well. So just want to identify what if any departments and/or programs are experiencing any type of surplus, and obviously what are our priorities with respect to shifting or repurposing those funds as part of our COVID-19 response, and how we as the council can and should be playing a role in those decisions. So that's it in a nutshell for me. I appreciate your time and attention. Look forward to hearing your testimony today, and appreciate Madam Chairwoman Wu for having this hearing. Thank you.
Thank you, Counselor Flaherty. Next up is Counselor Ed Flynn.
Thank you, Counselor Wu, and thank you, Counselor Flaherty. I also want to say thank you to Justin and the administration as well for your testimony later on and Q&A as well. That's all I have. Thank you, Counselor Wu.
Thank you. Next, Counselor Liz Braden.
Thank you, Councillor Wu. I'm just curious. I share Councillor Flaherty's curiosity about are there any surpluses that could, and how we're going to use them. It seems that the snow emergency thing is sort of an obvious suspect in this situation, but I also understand that we may not have had snow, but we've had lots of ice. So I understand that the surpluses may not be as large as anticipated, but since this is my first year on the council, I'm eager to learn more about the mechanics of how this budget works, and I'll listen and learn this afternoon. I may not have too many questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Counselor. Next, Counselor Kenzie Bach.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Pleased to be here today. I just want to commend the maker and say, you know, I think this is going to be a year ahead in which we are looking at every possible source for, you know, funding this an extraordinary set of unexpected expenses, and also a very atypical, you know, decrease in expected revenues. So I think this is a good and proper thing for the council to be looking into. And I'm happy as the Ways and Means Chair to be over in the sister committee of post-audit, now newly reconstituted. So thank you so much, Madam Chair.
Must feel good. You can click off your screen anytime. Not sharing. We are
Now.
grateful for you. We are very grateful, Kenzie. Okay, next up is Counselor Anissa Sabi-George.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm just happy to be here for this hearing. It is certainly I don't think post-audit has existed since I've joined the council 4.5 years ago. So excited about this hearing, and can't wait to learn more. I will be in and out of the hearing as I do have another commitment, but we'll bounce back and forth. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. Next, just for opening statements, we will go to, oops, I think counselors had been stuck in the waiting room. I'm very, very sorry. So we are also joined by Counselor Julia Mejia and Counselor Andrea Campbell. We'll start with Counselor Mejia.
Oh my goodness, can we not start with me, Michelle? I just got in. I was having
Sure.
Can you go with someone who's more seasoned and probably ready to go? I gotta go get my little notes here, okay?
Okay. Counselor Campbell, are you good for an opening statement?
Thank you, Councillor Wu, and God love Councillor Mejia. I just love you. No, just thank you for Councillor Flaherty for filing the hearing order. Look forward to hearing from the administration, their presentation. Thank you, Councillor Wu.
Thank you. Okay. Oh, and our council president, Kim Janey, is here as well. President Janey, would you like to make an opening statement?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Just wanted to thank the maker. Certainly thank you, Madam Chair. Certainly important to reflect back and see how we have spent our city's resources, and make sure that we are taking lessons from that and applying them as we move forward in this FY21 budget process. So I'm appreciative to have this conversation actually during our current budget season. So thank you. I look forward to a good conversation.
Thank you, President Janey. So I think that's all the counselors. So Counselor Mejia, give a wave when you're
I'm ready.
ready. Okay. All right. All yours.
Can you see me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. All right. So this is okay. So I'm sorry. I was such a liar. So my opening remarks are thank you, Councillor Flaherty, for hosting this. And Chairwoman Michelle Wu for bringing us together. I'd like to thank the maker and the chair for holding this hearing. I think for a lot of families right now, we're learning just how important it is to spend every penny as wisely as possible. The outbreak of COVID-19 has put a lot of working families in a tough spot. They're not sure how they're going to pay their rent. They don't know how they're going to keep their small businesses alive. And many might not even know whether or not they've got enough money to put food on the table. I've said this many times, but we as a city tend to act when we have the political will to do so. We also talk about how the budget is a value statement. I think this hearing is the perfect opportunity to make that belief a reality. I'm excited for this conversation and look forward to getting to the work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councilor Mejia. So you heard from a few councilors' statements that folks are curious about the snow removal budget. So want to make sure that I'm sure that will be in Justin's presentation. I think I'm also interested as a committee chair in thinking about how we're setting up a structure. You know, this year I think the timing was a little bit thrown off with the pandemic and everything, but our Ways and Means chairwoman and I had discussed briefly, ideally, what the structure is between post-audit, reviewing the city's audit, and then kind of folding into the next year's look ahead through the Ways and Means process and the budget approval process. So it'd be good just to know not just the buckets of what might be sort of unspent that was previously allocated in last year's budget season, but also what the city's internal processes are for tracking that kind of week to week, month to month, or whatever the right frequency is. So with that, we'll hand it over to Justin Starett, Budget Director for the City of Boston. But it feels like Justin is with us every day, all day now. So thank you for making this extra time to take part in this hearing as well.
Happy to. So I have a presentation I'm going to go through. If you could, I'm going to share my screen. Is that coming through?
Yes, looks good.
Great. So good afternoon, Council. Thank you for having me. Thank you to Councilor Flaherty for hosting this hearing today. As you mentioned, Councilor Wu, my name is Justin Starett. I'm the City of Boston's Budget Director. I'm going to give a brief presentation on the status of the FY20 budget, including some of the projected deficits and surpluses, as well as the FY20 revenue issues that we're monitoring, which I think is an important conversation to have here. Councilor Bach mentioned that in addition to surpluses and deficits we have on the spending side, we also have a tremendous uncertainty on the revenue side, which is an important thing to balance out in this conversation. And then I'm going to quickly touch on some COVID-related costs and some of the resources that we're targeting that you may be familiar with and have thankfully, thanks to you, passed through the City Council already and will hopefully continue to do so in the future. So starting, before I get into the specifics of the numbers, I wanted to set the framework a little bit. The numbers that I'm going to talk about today are as of March 31st, 2020, or the first 3 quarters of the fiscal year. So to your point, Councilor Wu, we really look at things in a quarterly basis, and that really gives us an opportunity to set the time frame for when we're looking at things, because as you all know, costs are spent and actually paid out in a really wide array of different time periods. You may have costs that are spent in December that don't actually get paid out the door until May. So looking at it on a quarterly basis is really the best way that we go about doing it. So when you look at these numbers, this is basically 75% of the way through the year, meaning that all the funding we have left has to cover the remaining 25% of the year. This snapshot also includes mostly spending prior to COVID-19, which also helps us set a baseline for how we think about making sure we balance the budget for the remainder of the year. As you know, we are not predicting, or as of right now, we are not predicting any type of overall surplus in the budget, sort of especially given some of the uncertainty we have in federal funding and COVID costs. FY20 revenue will be severely affected by COVID-19, so we need to be very careful with how we manage any surpluses our finances may show for the rest of the year. The goal is to always end the year in balance, and we're going to do everything we can to avoid running a deficit. And that's really what my office spends a lot of time doing, is as we manage any or project any surpluses and any deficiencies, we also have to manage that revenue side of the equation to make sure that we're balancing the overall budget at the end of the day. So moving on to some of the top line numbers for the budget. As you know, the FY20 budget passed by the council totaled $3.493 billion. As of March 31st, the city had expended or encumbered, which is a commitment to expend that funding, of 2.59 billion, or about almost exactly 75% of the 3.493 billion that was appropriated for FY20. This tracks almost exactly with how far we are through the year at this time period and leaves us 25% of funding available to cover 25% of the year. So it keeps us basically on track to balance the budget by the end of the year. Now, going into sort of some specifics within that 3.493 billion, about 1.83 billion, or about 52% of the budget, covers salaries, overtime, and other employee expenses. That's both for public safety, city departments, and school department. Through March 31st, we have expended about 1.195 billion, or about 65% on those employee costs. While this lags a little bit behind the overall spending that we have to date, there's really two reasons for that. As many of you may know, payroll runs about 2 weeks after the expenses are incurred. So sort of the last 2 weeks in March didn't get captured. They don't get captured until the April time period. And the second thing is we also have a traditionally higher payroll in the spring and summer because of some of our seasonal employees like Hokies and Public Works, a lot of seasonal employees in parks, as well as summer jobs. So we really intend and we expect to spend the full amount of the employee expenses that we have. And it's really just a timing issue that's keeping it slightly behind the overall spending. Two areas of the budget that are spending faster than the time period allows are fixed costs and other expenses. Fixed costs represent about 21% of the city budget. And through March 31st, we have expended about 624 million, or about 81% of available funding. Because these are fixed costs, we expect that these resources will be expended by the end of the year. And the reason that we have sort of expended more than the 75% that we have through the time period is because things like pensions and debt service are paid out in big lump sums throughout the year. So we really see it's less of a seasonal expenditure and something that happens in big chunks. So that's something that's tracking along fine. The other expenses that the city has, these are for things like utilities, contractors, supplies, represent about $897 million of the budget, or about 26%. And we have spent or encumbered about 86% of funding and have about 14%, or about 126 million remaining to cover the last quarter of the year. And we do also expect to expend that. So within the numbers that I just mentioned, I wanted to mention a few of the potential departmental deficits and surpluses we are tracking. We believe that through balancing both these deficits and surpluses, we are going to end the year in balance, but it's something we're continuing to monitor. As of right now, we are tracking expected deficits in the following areas: police and fire overtime of about 7 to 9 million and 2 to 4 million respectively, based on increased operating hours so far through FY20. We're also seeing a potential deficit in waste removal of between 1 million and 3 million. Now, this is something we're going to track throughout the rest of the year, but based on recycling rates that have come in higher since we budgeted for last year, as well as the increased demand for residential pickup of trash and recycling, because a lot more people are obviously in their homes, that is something that we are tracking as a potential deficit to manage throughout the year. As far as on the surplus side, Councilor Flaherty, you are exactly right. We definitely did have a light winter, and we are tracking a $6 to $8 million snow surplus as of March 31st. While that is good news, it does not take into account some of the typical vehicles and repairs purchases and supplies we purchase every spring. One of the things that we do every year is we go into our snow vehicle fleet and supplies, and we try to repurchase some of those at the end of the calendar, or at the end of the fiscal year, to get us prepared for next year. So while we do have a $6 to $8 million surplus right now, and that is something that we are fortunate because of the winter that we had, it is before we have started to process some of the repairs and spring supply purchases that we normally make. A couple other small surpluses that we're tracking. Utilities across the city are tracking a modest $2 to $4 million surplus based on favorable utility rates and gas prices. I don't have to tell you that gas is quite a bit cheaper than what it was normally, so that is something that we're tracking. Employee health insurance is tracking slightly better, about 2 to 4 million as well. but something we are monitoring in a post-COVID world. So as employees are starting to access healthcare, we are sort of tracking a $2 to $4 million surplus, but this was, again, before March 31st. So we're curious to see how a post-COVID world is going to look like for employee healthcare. And finally, the transportation department is tracking a small surplus of between 1 and 3 million because we are issuing fewer parking tickets and parking meters. We are spending less on our vendors who process those payments for us. While that is sort of a small good news thing, there is a much worse bad news component of that, is because we are drastically reduced the number of parking enforcements that we have done, really just focusing on the safety ones, and parking meters across the city are down pretty significantly. There is a much bigger revenue loss on the revenue side of the ledger that more than makes up this parking tickets and meters surplus. So that is something that we're sort of happy to see, a small surplus, but something that we're really concerned with on the revenue side of things. So speaking of revenue, I wanted to spend a little bit of time this afternoon talking about the revenue challenges that we are tracking and that will impact how we close the year in balance. Sort of prior to COVID-19, we were tracking at or above our revenue collection projections for FY20. But since March, we have been tracking significant revenue declines over a few different categories. As you all know, excise taxes is obviously the biggest one. It includes declines in meals, occupancy, aircraft fuel. This is data we're waiting from the state to receive, but we expect significant declines, especially in room occupancy and aircraft. Meals is going to be a somewhat modest decline because restaurants have been able to remain open and do some takeout and some delivery. So there is a baseline that is going to continue. But occupancy at hotels is down dramatically. We are still waiting to get some information from short-term rentals about what type of market they've been seeing. But that is something that we're going to hopefully get from the state in the coming weeks and months. And then aircraft fuel revenue from Logan Airport is down significantly, but again, something that is given to the state on a quarterly basis. So we do not have the projections in hand from the state for March and April, and certainly through May so far, but that is something we're hoping to get in the coming weeks. And as I mentioned before, parking fines and meter fees are going down as well, mostly because we are just prioritizing safety violations, and there's a lot less car traffic in the city to generate the parking meter. So that is something we're monitoring both from the general fund perspective, but also from the parking meter fund perspective. Interest on investments is down due to the recent rate cuts by the Federal Reserve. The Fed had cut rates twice in the past 6 months, more than what we had been expecting to stimulate the economy and generate investment by the private sector. So that is something that is affecting us because our interest rate that we get for our rainy day fund is down considerably. And then finally, on departmental revenue, while many permits are still available online, some small department fees and permits are down, given a bit given the uncertainty that COVID-19 is driving. It's less a matter of the availability of permits and more that folks are just, I think as Councilor Mejia mentioned, just trying to struggle to get by. And I think that that's something that we're seeing in a couple small areas. The one sort of guiding light at the end of this is that property taxes are obviously an area of strength for the city. Going into 19, we had the largest new growth number. Going into the COVID-19 pandemic, we had the largest new growth number in the city, and that's going to help us mitigate some of these losses. And it's something that we're going to continue to track as final tax payments come in for June 1. But through the sort of FY20 revenue losses that we have in some of the small surpluses in property taxes, we are really aiming to land the ship as balanced for FY20. And that's something that my office and the rest of the entire ANF cabinet is spending a lot of time on right now to make sure that we don't dip into our rainy day fund in order to close FY20. The last thing I wanted to touch on, and I know it's a really important topic for both the council and the city, is the COVID-19 related spending and resources. And I know we've been in front of you a few times over the past couple of weeks talking about it, but I wanted to highlight some of the areas that we have been and will continue to spend funding on, and the resources that we're hoping to tap in order to pay for it. So far the city is expending significant funding to both protect our city employees who are delivering critical city services, as well as enable significant new programs that are necessary because of the public health guidance. This includes personal protective equipment for public safety and city staffers. That's both since March 31st and something that we're going to have to do going forward. cleaning and disinfecting of public areas and city facilities. That is something that obviously we're doing in City Hall right now with a limited opening window, but something that we're going to have to likely ramp up significantly as we move towards a reopening, given the governor's guidance that he announced today, but that's something that is likely to come in future months. Technology to enable telework capabilities. Obviously, this was a lot to do with getting city employees the technology they need to be able to work remotely. Obviously, that is something that's going to continue going forward, as not all city staff will be back in the building at the same time, given the public health guidance. Cost of distance learning. So obviously, this includes Chromebooks and software, and that is something that we're going to continue to monitor and continue to prioritize, both as we get towards summer learning, which is going to be a sort of expanded and slightly different model this year. And then obviously, as we think a little bit about next school year, what that's going to look like given the public health guidance, but that is something that the school department is continuing to work on. And then finally, the public health and medical expenditures that we've had to make, chief among them, Boston Hope. We have stood up Boston Hope going on, I want to say 7 weeks at this point. We have had, I think, close to 1,000 folks come into the respite side of the building, and about another 700 or so on the medical side. That is something that is a sort of a significant expense that the city has undertaken, working with the state, Partners Healthcare, and the BCEC and MEMA up at the state. So that is something that we're continuing to work with and prioritize every day. The good news is we think that a lot of those costs are going to be covered by some of the new resources that have been made available to us. One of the ones we have not talked a lot about so far, but something that we plan on coming to the council with in the coming weeks, is FEMA reimbursement. So in addition to some of the other federal funding, FEMA reimbursement is something that we are going to pursue vigorously, because that is really an untapped and uncapped resource that we think is going to be a real benefit for the city when it comes to some of the spending that I mentioned. And that is something that we are sort of eagerly working on with our state partners who help us with the submittal process to the Fed. So more to come on that in the coming weeks, but that is something that we are going to prioritize first and foremost. The second bucket of funding that we're going to use to cover COVID-related expenses is the CARES Act. So as many of you know, thanks to the council's passing of the CARES Act funding 2 weeks ago, I think at this point, maybe it was a week ago, we have access to up to $121 million for public health related measures, a lot of which are going to be covered by what we've talked about already. And we think that with that funding and FEMA, that will cover the majority of our costs related to COVID-19. So we think we're in a relatively good place when it comes to both the public health costs and the public safety costs that we've had to incur and will incur between basically going back to the beginning of April through December, which is when the CARES Act money runs out. And then finally, I just want to throw a little bit of a plug out there for some shared advocacy. Many of you may know that the U.S. House passed the HEROES Act, which could potentially provide even more funding back to the state and cities. And we look forward to its consideration and hopeful passage in the U.S. Senate. But as I'm sure many of you have seen, some of the pushback already from the U.S. Senate means that this bill is likely going to change significantly. So that is something that we would encourage everyone in Boston, because we really will benefit from that funding if it does in fact pass in its current form. So that is something that we have on our radar and we're continuing to monitor, and something that we're going to certainly to continue to advocate for going forward. And we would encourage everyone in the city to do that as well. So I know that was a lot, and I will sort of stop right there, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Justin. Colleagues, for questions?
Councilor Wu, you're muted. I couldn't hear you.
Oh, go ahead, Councilor Flaherty. Questions?
Oh, very good. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. Justin, I appreciate your thorough analysis there and attention to detail with the presentation. So I guess I'll touch base on, there was one piece that you had for the meals, occupancy, parking fees and fines, license and permits, as well as interest on investments. When, given there's been a dip in that, from your vantage point, when will we sort of realize or feel that pain, if you will? Will it be Q1 or Q2 or Q3? How do you sort of forecast when
Yep.
we've had to shut down with, we don't have the meter maids going out, and we don't have the volume of cars, as you mentioned, building permits and licenses and fees, fines, meals, all of that. Everything is down, and looks like it will be down for a little bit longer. And then as it sort of starts to come up, it's probably going to, I would assume it's going to come up slowly as well. So there'll be a big chunk of that revenue, if you will, that is basically just disappeared. When will we feel the impacts on that?
Yep. Yeah, it's a great question, and it's really an extended time period that we're going to feel it. Some of the initial ones that you mentioned, so excise taxes, aircraft, meals, and occupancy, they get remitted to the state in real time. So the March gets submitted to the state in April, and then it gets sent to us in May. So there's a little bit of a lag. These are all FY20 revenues that we're talking about right now. But you're exactly right. This is going to be a extended ramping up and ramping back to normalcy. That is certainly something that we're going to feel the pinch of, both in the end of this fiscal year, FY20, but then also going into FY21. When we submitted the budget for FY21 back in beginning of April, we kind of built the assumptions that we would get back to normal in a sort of somewhat sooner time period. If folks can even remember this far back, the original stay-at-home order was until April 26th, and we assumed that sort of the economy would slowly start to open back up in the beginning of May and June, and really get back to, not full capacity in July, but closer to maybe 60 or 70%, depending on the measure. I think that is an area of concern for us as we think about both the end of closing out FY20. So I do want to stress that the parking meters and some of those other revenue sources you mentioned, those are going to hit FY20's budget. So when we think about surpluses and we think about deficits, we have to think about it both as a spending surplus, a spending deficit, but also a revenue deficit at the end of the day. So when we think about, the $100 million in new growth, which is what we saw for FY20, a lot of that's going to get eaten up pretty quickly by, the dramatic declines in parking meter revenue and parking tickets that have basically come to a halt in FY20. So that's really something that we're concerned with making sure we land the plane in balance in FY20. And then as we think about FY21, I'm heartened to see that there is some guidance, obviously the governor's guidance that came out today, and we're going to sort of digest that and understand what it means for Boston. But that's going to, potentially change our thinking about how quickly revenue sources are going to come back into the city that we rely on, like excise taxes, and sort of what that means, whether it's different levels of, if a restaurant can only operate at certain capacities, or hotels are only going to be operating at certain capacities. Those are all areas that are going to affect our revenue. And as the city, starts to dig into the governor's guidance and understand it and process it, and then eventually provide guidance to our businesses, that's an area that is going to inform a lot of our decisions for FY20, or our projections for FY20, I should say.
You had referenced some of the departments that were running, I guess, a little bit of a deficit based on COVID-19. So I'm assuming that the slowdown will impact city departments that have incurred non-budgeted expenses. And as you recall, a couple of weeks ago, we had a hearing with respect to the grant, the federal coronavirus relief fund grant.
Mm-hmm.
How will that funding be used, I guess, to support city departments that have incurred the non-budget expenses? So, for example, like in say D&D, the sort of the senior home repair, arguably probably has come to a grinding halt, as well as sort of the Parks and Rec fitness programmings and other stuff, other programs. And then, but on the slideshow that you described, that there are some that are incurring sort of significant non-budgeted expenses. And so I guess the question I have is, how does that federal Corona Relief Fund apply there?
Yep, absolutely. And it's a great question. The tricky part with the Coronavirus Relief Fund is that the funding can't be budgeted. So basically, if we were to transfer funding between parks and say police to pay for some PPE, that would actually automatically trigger the funding not being eligible for federal funding. So a lot of those programs you mentioned are still operating. A lot of them are either delayed or they're whether it's a senior home repair, and we're hopefully going to play a little bit of catch up when things start to open up starting today on the senior home repair. Or if they are a surplus, they're going to sort of fall to the overall city surplus to make sure that we can balance the books. The goal with all the post-COVID, sort of post-March 31st spending that we think is eligible for federal funding is to really maximize that federal funding, right? The first thing we want to do is get as much funding from the federal government and access it as much as possible. So all of the costs that we've started to incur, whether it's for the PPE or Boston Hope or schools or all those types of areas, the line of first defense is going to be the federal funding, as opposed to sort of transferring budgeted funds from somewhere else, because that would sort of automatically trigger it not being eligible for federal funding anymore. So that's something that we want to be really careful that we're maximizing our federal money, and at the same time, those surpluses are going to help offset deficits in other places, right? So I mentioned some of the non-COVID deficits that we have. So I mentioned police and fire overtime. I mentioned public works through the trash collection. So those are two areas that are pre-COVID deficits that we had, that as we're thinking about balancing the books between city operating budget surpluses and deficits, but then also revenue deficits, that's all going to help us land the plane for FY20. So that's something that we're going to continue to monitor and sort of maximize the amount of federal money we get and make sure that we balance the budget for FY20 without using free cash.
So Justin, you'll basically be running sort of two spreadsheets. One spreadsheet will be tracking which departments have had to stop running particular programs as a result of COVID-19, and whether or not they're running a surplus. And obviously the other one is tracking sort of the federal coronavirus relief fund, making sure that they're going to the stated purpose, which is identifying areas that were non-budgeted, I guess, and therein lies the relief. So you're sort of a little bit of a balancing act to identify, and some departments may be running a surplus because of programming cuts, but at the same time a deficit on the other side because they're in shoulder deep with respect to the COVID-19 response. So that's going to be a little tricky, kind of balancing that, or at least keeping an eye on it. And then just lastly, because I know my colleagues have some questions, just a sneak peek, I guess, into Q4 as to how many people or how many companies did not pay their property tax. You seem to be pretty optimistic and encouraging by those numbers, which is obviously that's exciting for me to hear, because basic city services relies on that. And my concern was that folks that were going to have the ability to pay, if they did not pay or pushed it off, we would feel the impacts on that fairly significantly, particularly as it pertains to our schools and public safety, et cetera. So from your vantage point, based on the Q4 numbers, were we off? And if so, how much? Or were we on par? Or where were your expectations with respect to that? And following now, as we head into Q1, do you think that trend will continue?
Great question. So we don't have a number to share with you today for property tax collections. Two reasons. One, we moved the date to June 1st. So that is something that, folks are still paying them as they come in. And two, we feel confident about it though, is because the vast majority of property taxes are paid through mortgage companies and escrow accounts. So those have continued, and we've seen that funding come in over the past couple of weeks that have indicated that folks are going to pay their property taxes. The other reason we're confident is folks, businesses, residents are looking at their expenses. They're very interested in maintaining their property taxes because of the value of the asset. I know I've done this in other hearings before, but the assessed value of properties is about 40% below where the maximum 2.5% would be if we decided to go all the way up to the level. So while taxes are certainly part of the pie of what folks are dealing with right now, it is a relatively small portion and is relatively it is relatively less expensive to our other neighboring communities when it comes to property taxes. So I think there's optimism for those two reasons, but it's certainly something we're going to monitor as we get into Q1.
And then Justin, just lastly, on the folks that have their property tax payments escrowed built into the mortgage. So is it the banks are just continuing to sort of remit those funds to municipalities, as in this instance, Boston, and then whether or not the lendee has the ability to pay or needs to work something out with the mortgage company. So I guess the mortgage companies didn't stop, or the banks didn't stop sending the check to the city. It's fair to say. In those instances, then a shout out quickly to Neil. Neil was great. I had a number of landlords who wanted to pay their property tax and couldn't get into City Hall because we were doing the Tuesday to Tuesday and Fridays only. So to Neil's credit, Neil was able to set up times for folks to come in and get the time and the attention at the window so that they could pay their property tax, which again was music to my ears because we need that very precious property tax revenue to fund all the services. So I appreciate your time and attention on this, Justin, and I appreciate the chairwoman for letting me exhaust some questions.
Thank you, Councillor. I know Councillor Flynn mentioned that he didn't have questions this round, so generously gave his time back to the group and for public testimony. So next after Councillor Flynn was Councillor Braden.
Thank you. I'm just curious about why we anticipate a surplus with regard to employee health insurance.
Yeah, absolutely. So our employee health insurance is based on the cases that we see. So if somebody goes to the doctor, the city is fully self-insured. So we pay the full bill when the doctor calls us, and we work very closely with our Public Employees Commission to manage that. That was something that came before the council a couple months ago at this point to talk about the health plans that we have in the city. And they are, we spend a lot of time to make sure that we're offering good coverage and that it's at a reasonable split between the employee and the employer. And we are running a surplus because basically less employees have gone to the doctor over the last 8 months since the beginning of July. So it's something we try to predict in how many folks are coming in and out of the doctor's office, but it's not something that we're ever able to sort of fully grasp. But the thing to note on that is that when we do run surpluses in the health insurance line, it falls to what is called the Health Insurance Trust Fund, which is something that we use in conjunction with the Public Employees Commission to help offset rate increases in future years. So when a normal increase might be 5% for an employee, we're able to reduce it because we've been able to roll forward those surpluses.
Excellent. Thank you. That answers my question. That's all I have for now.
Thank you, Councillor Braden. Next was Councillor Bach.
Great. Thank you, Councillor Wu. And thank you, Justin. Oh, I've lost Justin. Oh, there he is. Yeah, thank you so much for this. I had a few questions. One of them was back on your slide about the fixed costs and the other expenses that were sort of trending ahead of pace. I was wondering if you could speak to, because with employees, which is trending behind pace, you spoke to the fact that it had to do with payroll, et cetera. But with those costs, my concern is that I did a quick calculation, and if those things continued in the fourth quarter as they were in the first three, that would be a hole of 197 million in our budget. So I'd love you to speak to why those aren't on track to do that, or whether in fact they are, and that's a major concern.
Yeah, absolutely. And apologies if I didn't do that, because that is a good question. On fixed costs, those are fixed payments we make throughout the year. So in debt service and pensions, we make large quarterly payments to both of those. So it basically comes in a little bit lumpy throughout the year. So we kind of get through most of the spending before we get to the fourth quarter of the fiscal year. So we're confident that that's going to land fine. On the other expenses, when we talk about expended and encumbered means we've committed to a contract of a certain amount, but we haven't actually seen the service. So basically, city departments say if they have a contract with somebody, they might encumber the full amount of the contract. So say for argument's sake, it's $100,000. They may have only spent 50% or 75%, depending on where they are in the year, but they have encumbered the full amount. Now, departments are constantly encumbering and de-encumbering, so it's a little bit of a that there's always going to be some that are encumbered and come in on a monthly basis. So it's not something that we're worried about overall exceeding the budget on. It's just how we end up doing the budgeting at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm. And how closely do you from the budget office, or are you able from the budget office to sort of track how much of what's sitting in that expended and encumbered is actually connected to Q4 versus prior?
So one of the things, thanks to you, Counselor, that we included in this year's package for every city department was a city spreadsheet of what has been budgeted, what has been expended, what has been encumbered, and what is available. So we can get a little bit of a snapshot. We really would have to go line by line and honestly contract by contract, because if you're a big department like police or public works, you may have many contracts within one line. So we do obviously have the capabilities to look at that on a one-by-one basis, but it's a little bit hard for me to pull out any trends about sort of if there are things that are backloaded at the end of the day.
I guess what I don't understand about that is it seems as though you're comfortable that, I mean, it would be a pretty disastrous hole if we were on pace for those things, and you're comfortable that that's not what's going on. So you must have a basis for kind of thinking, like, whether it's historical or whatever, oh, we actually do 15 to 20% of our spending in Q4 in these categories. Like, is it something like that?
I apologize, I don't have it in front of me. It's probably the difference between what's been expended and what's been encumbered in this instance. So because this covers a broad swath of different activities, and I bucketed it this way so we wouldn't spend all day going through each of the contracts. But a contract may have a full budget for the year, which makes me believe that that's the entire budget, but a utility that gets paid quarterly or that gets paid monthly. So we feel pretty confident that the amount encumbered is probably a big portion of the or at least a decent portion of what's been expended as well. And I'd have to go back and pull up the exact data of what the split is between what's expended and what's been encumbered, but I'm sure that that's what gives us the confidence, and that is what gives us the confidence that we won't expand it.
Mm-hmm. And then in terms of, when I totaled up the sort of current surpluses and deficits that we're tracking, I mean, if you took the worst case scenario, you end up with just the ones you threw up on your slide, you end up down 5 million. If you took the best case situation, you end up 9 million. And obviously there's another dimension to landing the plane here, right? Because there's the whole revenue side. So I guess you've made a few references to landing the plane, but I guess I just wonder, like, where you actually think we are on that right now.
I think it's safe to say that we will end the year in balance. That is something that we will spend every waking moment between now and June 30th doing. The challenge is when to understand what is a $7 million deficit versus a $9 million deficit, and that's something that we work with departments continuously throughout the year. I think the one thing that's going to help us balance the budget at the end of the day is when we start moving expenses over to the revenue side or over to the federal grant side of the equation, because that's going to allow us to free up some funding that either was repurposed, like Councilor Flaherty said, or was expended before we thought that there was going to be COVID-related revenue coming. I think we're going to end the plan. We always plan on spending down to the penny. That is our goal every year. We've been fortunate the last few years to run very small surpluses that we've been able to dedicate towards pension funding. I think something like that is something that we're probably a little bit concerned with, our ability to sort of make supplemental pension payments. But we do think that sort of the core bones of the budget will end in balance.
Okay, and can you speak a little bit to the police and fire overtimes? Obviously a perennial issue that we worry about. And I'm curious what proportion of that deficit you all feel is attributable to the COVID-19 crisis versus what of it is just standard operations prior to, say, the 1st of March.
Yep. So I would say that the 7 to 9 and the 2 to 4 are pre-March 31st. So there may be some small COVID-related costs that are captured in there at the very beginning of March. But for the most part, this was a pre-COVID projection of what we thought the fire and police would run for deficits. Now, the one thing I will say is these are projections, and they take into account the actual overtime we've expended between June and, say, March 31st, but it also makes assumptions around what we normally do for overtime in April, May, and June. With the dramatic decrease in events and other public thing. We think that these numbers are probably on the higher end and will probably come down a bit because we'll have less of public events that will be going on, whether festivals or parades or sports games, something like that. So we think that that number is on the higher end, but given that construction did just start back up, we do feel like there will still be some deficit, but it's a little bit, this is a purely kind of mostly non-COVID related number, I would say.
For now is just in terms of the revenue side, on the positive side, how much does it look like our new growth number came in over what we had anticipated in the FY20 budget?
Yeah, so the new growth number for FY20 was 99 million. So obviously a sort of an unprecedented and historic time, way higher than any other time we've ever had. We had budgeted at about $65 million, if my memory serves me, for new growth in FY20. The numbers that the areas that I talked about, whether it was motor vehicle, room occupancy, parking meters, we're looking at a revenue loss in the neighborhood. So that would give you about $35 million, $34 million. The revenue loss that we are experiencing and will likely experience when we get the data from the state is in that neighborhood, if not exceeding it. So that money is basically going to partially offset the lost revenue that we're going to have when it comes to parking, excise, interest on investments, other areas that I mentioned, some of the smaller areas. So I think that is a sort of a saving grace that we have that helped balance the budget this year. But it kind of gives us a lot of pause going into next year, and because that's something that we're not sure. Right? A lot of the new growth number for FY21 is going to be heavily based on what's happening right now, and I think I drove through Dudley this morning on my way to work, and I was just very happy to see that a lot of the projects that are going on in there have started to restart, and that gives me a lot of hope that we'll be able to get back and running sooner rather than later. But I that's not something I can project right now.
Okay, but it's very useful that our two revenue numbers, it means there's more of an offset to the revenue than there would have been otherwise. So. Okay, thanks so much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Bach. Next up, Councillor Mejia.
Okay, great. I'm next. Did the order change, Chairman-woman?
I'm going off of the order in the. Oh, it was just that Councillor Sabi George stepped away, so she's no longer here. So you're up next.
Okay, lucky I'm prepared for to roll. Okay, so thank you, Justin. I really do appreciate you being here. I'm going to ask you my questions one at a time so we can have a little dialogue. And I will say that if I get a little bit confused on what you're saying, I'm going to be like, I'll raise my hand so that you can break it down in a way that I can understand it, okay?
Absolutely, happy to.
Okay, so you mentioned that some of the surplus money in the past has been used for pension payments. And I'm just curious as how else has the surplus money been used in the past?
So normally a surplus, the money falls to the city stabilization fund. One of the things that we've been able to do in really targeted ways is, I think I mentioned some of it with the snow conversation, is when we get through a snow season and say we have a couple $1 million left over in the budget for that, we're able to either pre-purchase or invest in some of the materials that we need for next year. So basically, if at the end of snow season we need to repair all the vehicles we have, instead of not repairing them, we can repair the vehicles and kind of get ahead of some investments. So I think it's in really targeted ways. If we have opportunities to purchase things that we know are going to be needed by the frontline departments, that's where we focus it on. Any remaining funding at the end of the year falls to what's called the rainy day fund, which is something that the city has grown over the past sort of 6 to 7 years.
Okay. Would it be possible to use some of those funds, and you could, yes or no would be good enough for me, but I'm always curious about how we can help increase community engagement, and just wondering whether or not we can earmark some of those rainy day funds to help support with translation, maybe food and removing barriers to engagement. Is that something that we can use some of those funds for, or is that a no-no?
So the way, sorry, I'll try to give a very short answer. The way that rainy day fund works is basically it's part of the budget every year. So we would rely on a certain amount. We would take the money out of the savings of the rainy day fund and spend it on something. I would personally, and I think the sort of the budget world would say that that's probably a no-no, just because I don't like to spend one-time revenues that we are going to desperately need if the sort of economic recession hits on one-time things.
Yeah, so the reason why I asked is because basically what I have seen in terms of language interpretation during the COVID-19, I just feel like, we can increase our capacity specifically around language access, and just, whether it's a rainy day or not, I just think that there's some infrastructure as a city that we need to really start thinking about, so that whether it's raining or not, that we're better prepared to serve folks in ways that are more culturally responsive. So that's kind of why I ask, just in general. But that's why I also said it might be a no-no, just because the way you all set up these funds. So it's all good. I'm just curious as to what the administration has done so far when it comes to thinking about how to use this money for COVID-19 relief. If we choose to use the surplus money to add to programs such as rental relief or other form of aid, how can we make the process easier for people to apply and easier for the administration to actually allocate that money?
It's a great question. I'm going to have to defer to my colleagues in D&D and economic development about the process by which we could streamline the applications. What I hoped came across in this presentation today was that we are not tracking an overall surplus to the city's budget this year. So while a certain department may have a surplus, we are tracking, sort of pretty significant deficits in certain departments already. We also have a tremendous revenue deficit that we're facing right now. So while an individual department might have a small surplus, the overall city budget may have a deficit. So that is something that we can't spend that money on something else. Otherwise, we'd have to dip into the rainy day fund to pay for it. So that's all stuff that we're sort of managing so that we can end the year in balance. But we don't believe that there's any sort of surplus city funding available at this point.
Okay. And can you tell me how the potential deficits for FY20 are similar or different from previous years?
Yeah, great question. I think that the police and fire overtime deficits, as Councilor Bach mentioned, are perennial things that happen. I think we actually work with the police department every year to set police and fire to set targets around number of overtime hours and the like, but it can vary widely depending on the events. I would say that these projections are probably smaller than what they have been in previous years, that we've seen $20 to $30 million deficits in overtime. We are not quite at that point right now. So that is, I think, a good sign, but at the same time, it's certainly something that we're going to continue to work with police and fire to get down over this year and then next year too.
Thank you. I got one more question or two, maybe. What role can the community play in deciding where the money goes? Do we have an opportunity for community involvement in this, or is this very insider type of thing that there's no process for that?
So I think the annual budget process is obviously through the council is as the public hearings and all that. I would say my office pre-COVID spent a lot of time with community engagement. We would go to every one of the mayor's not public events, but every one of the mayor's coffee hours and other sort of citywide events that we would have, and we would hold a station where we would have materials that we would make available to the public. And I would also bring analysts from my staff who focus in different areas, whether it's parks or transportation, and they would be able to answer specific questions for folks that have departments. That usually generates questions and comments that we then take back to departments to try to figure out if it's feasible to do it or not. So I'd say that the budget process is where we try to focus all of our community engagement. Then obviously the council process is another opportunity for community engagement.
Thank you. And my last question, and you've done such a great job at being concise that I haven't hit my 7-minute mark yet. So how can we use this budget surplus to invest in communities that have been historically underrepresented?
Again, a fair question. I think I don't believe that we're going to have an overall budget surplus. I think our goal is going to be to land the plane in balance, as I've said. I think when we're looking at types of new revenue sources, I really think that the HEROES Act that I mentioned at the end there is where we can make some serious investments in other places. And obviously that is still TBD. And that's something that hopefully, through our delegation, we've made known that we support. But that would be really an opportunity to put some targeted new funding out to the community.
Thank you. You've done such a great job at being concise that I think I'm good.
Thank you, Councilor.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Councilor Mejia. Next up, Councilor Campbell.
Thank you, Councilor Wu, and thank you, Justin, for the presentation. I guess two questions. One, actually, I'll sort of align with Councilor Mejia's question around the intentionality of investing some of the surplus in communities of color or certain neighborhoods, right? And I know looking forward doesn't look like we'll have a surplus, but in past cycles, wondering if there's sort of been some intentionality in the past. And then the second question, which is somewhat related, is what is the sort of decision-making process? What is the process with respect to talking to departments, department heads to decide where the surplus might go? Who's at the table? Is it just the budget office looking at the requests that came in from departments, what they could fulfill at one point, what they couldn't, that kind of thing?
Yeah, very fair questions. I think from a surplus perspective, we work very closely with departments on a daily and monthly basis and quarterly basis to try to project what they have. Now, we are naturally pretty conservative as a sort of an A&F cabinet. I think that's our goal, is to make sure that we land each department's budget in balance. We also are very mindful that the council appropriates funding for certain purposes. So sort of appropriating or spending that funding on something that is not, related to that department's mission or related to that department's core is probably something that we would shy away from. We wouldn't take a public works surplus and spend it on something, because I think that would be sort of disingenuous to the budget process necessarily. So I think that when we're working with departments on a monthly and weekly basis, and we get to the, in a normal time period, a sort of a pre-COVID-19 time period, when we get to this time of the year, we would say to them, hey, you didn't end up hiring that position, until December, but you hired it, you plan to hire him in July, but you hired him in December. Is there some sort of targeted similar type function you could do in the near term to spend it? And sometimes there are, and sometimes there aren't. But I would say that, the same time that we have a deficit this year in certain departments, we have deficits other years in different departments. So it's all about, I think my office, the role we play is trying to make sure that the deficits don't outweigh the surpluses throughout the entire city. So that takes a little bit of management and a little bit of sort of working with departments to set priorities and set expectations. But I think if there are surpluses on an annual basis and departments can use them for focused one-time investments, we try to work with them to do it. I think the snow example of repairing vehicles or purchasing supplies that are snow related is probably the best example of how and when we use any surpluses.
And more concretely, if there is a decision made with respect to, like the snow example, is that the budget office sort of you guys that make that decision, or it's in partnership with the mayor or other departments? Who has the final decision making? I mean, outside of like the mayor. I imagine you submit recommendations to him, right? It might be, here are our 3 suggestions on this surplus. Here are our 2 suggestions. Just curious on that process.
Yeah, I think it's not something that we don't normally budget to have surpluses. So I think it's something that it comes up relatively infrequently, and it's really in targeted areas. I think we hear from departments that they may have a need, or they may have something that they've demonstrated is something that they either a project didn't get started quite on time, or it came in cheaper occasionally. So it's not always that there's not a formal process by which we process requests to spend surpluses. There is we do, as part of our financial process, we stop buying new things at a certain point of the year, basically at the beginning of May. And that's mostly because we don't want to overexpend money. We get to that point of the year, we will talk to departments and say, hey, are there any major procurements that you need to do? And that's, most of the time they fall within their budgets, but sometimes if they are trying to either repurpose a different surplus or they want to spend something else, that's when we'll have a conversation with them. But there's not a real formal process by which we sort of talk about surpluses or deficiencies.
Thank you, Justin. Continue to stay safe.
Thank you, Councilor. You good? Okay, great. then was Council President Janey.
Hey, thank you. This has been a really thorough, good discussion. And so I think a lot of the points that I would raise about investing a surplus in communities that historically have been left out have already been raised, though what I'm hearing from you, Justin, pretty loud and clear is that while certain departments like snow removal may have a surplus right now, taking a snapshot at today, given that there are deficits running with the overtime, those public safety departments, in the end, we're looking at, your hope is just to be able to land the ship, as I understand it, without a deficit. So we're probably not looking at a surplus. And I want to just give you kudos because I am confident that you will be able to do that. And that's through just good management and stewardship. So I want to say thank you to you for that. But I worry, you know, what is happening in this final quarter, I guess, I worry about how much of this is carrying over into the first quarter in FY21. So I would be really interested in trying to understand more some of the fourth quarter things like around the overtime. How long, for example, is that you got a light issue too?
Yeah, sorry, it's an automatic light. I apologize.
Is this better? Yeah. So for example, if I see that it looked like there were the slide, I don't know what page it was, but it looked like there was some OT, overruns. And how much of that do we think will continue into the first quarter of FY21, for example? Those are the kinds of questions that I would really be interested in understanding. I know we spent a lot of time talking about the property tax, pretty confident given that you said a good majority of folks pay into an equity, what's the word? Escrow, thank you. That's where mine goes to. Mine goes into the escrow, then the lender pays it. What percentage though is that? When you say large majority, is it like 90%? Like,
that's a good question. I'd have to follow up with our collecting department.
But so many that you're not really worried about what is happening with the deferment of June 1 for the last tax quarter and what that's doing to our revenue?
So I think we feel very confident in the fourth quarter numbers for FY20, which normally would have come in on May 1st, but we've pushed to June 1st. I think we feel like a vast majority of that has either already come in or is coming in through escrow companies through the past couple of weeks, and it's in the process. I think there is certainly a portion of people who pay their own property taxes, and I think that's why we're working.
Yeah. Do we know how many though?
So I don't have a number.
Okay, no worries. But the vast majority comes in through the escrow, and the escrow, the lender's paying it. So we're not really worried about that. That sounds good. So again, to this point about what is happening now in this fourth quarter, if FY20, so we saw the public safety with the overtime numbers going up. I'm assuming that cost around cleaning supplies and or staffing around those kinds of things, perhaps we're seeing go up. And with the so-called opening happening so late in the quarter, I wonder what we're anticipating projecting out for first quarter FY21, because some of it we're not going to know. For example, enforcement. So when we think about, okay, May 18th, some things are opening. I expect we're going to see more enforcement going up as they're going out to inspect, make sure everyone understands and what's going on, and maybe there'll be some fines. Hopefully not, but I would anticipate now that the Commonwealth is slowly phasing into opening back up, that certain departments like ISD will see an uptick. And so I wonder, because we're just not going to know enough in these last 6 weeks of the fiscal year. I mean, how are you using that to project what we need in FY21 around inspections, around public safety, et cetera, et cetera?
Yep. And
technology too. So this whole remote working, so those areas, that'd be really
and remote learning, all that.
Yeah.
So I think from a COVID related response and reopening, we're really targeting three things. The FEMA money that we are sort of working on right now that we'll be coming to the council with in a couple weeks. The CARES Act, which was the funding passed by the council last week or 2 weeks ago, which was up to $121 million to spend on public health related measures. A lot of the stuff you mentioned, cleaning, PPE, enforcement, we think would probably qualify as public health related measures. So we really are targeting those costs to those resources. What that doesn't cover though is lost revenue. So when we submitted the budget back in April, we projected an 8% decline in excise tax revenue. And we basically built that on the understanding that at the time, the public health measures ran through the end of April. So we assumed, a very slow ramp up of the economy starting in May, June, July into the next year. I think what we've learned in the past month is that the public health stay-at-home order was extended by several weeks. So that obviously changes some of our thinking. And then we think that obviously still digging into the governor's announcement today about, what would come back in different phases and how that's going to look. But that's going to at least give us a little bit of a roadmap that says this is a best case scenario. This is how quickly things would open up. This is likely, a potential worst case scenario. And that's going to help us make projections on the revenue side of the equation. I think the big, elephant in the room is if the federal government comes in with the HEROES Act, that's really going to be a helpful aspect to the city that's going to help manage our costs. So we are sort of encouraging and anybody who I talk to, I say, call your senator, call your rep, and advocate for the HEROES Act, because that's really going to be how we balance our books. And then the other side of things, which we didn't really spend a lot of time talking about today, is state aid. So state aid is still an unknown at this point. We have the governor's number from January, and we have not heard anything specific since then on what that looks like. The state's budget is going to have to be bailed out as well by the federal government, and that is certainly something that the HEROES Act would help do. So if the federal government can support the state budget, that will also help them with our funding that we get from the state. So those are kind of the three, COVID-related funding through the CARES Act, revenue impacts that we're going to try to project, and federal funding are really the three things that are up in the air right now. I think
that's helpful. Let me ask you this: are you then projecting out three different scenarios? Best cases, we get the HEROES Act, we get state aid that we anticipated, and we're in good shape for FY21 moving forward, which is what I think we all hope to be in, and confident that we will in FY20 in a good place. What I'm interested in understanding too is, because I think, to our conversation, I think FY20 we're good. Like, I'm confident you're going to land this plane, but I'm really worried about FY21, and then even more so about FY22 when we get to that point. But I would be interested if, for example, we have a number from the governor back in January. What if, God forbid, we see a 10% reduction on that number? Are you painting scenarios like that for us moving forward, or no? We're just kind of hoping that number he told us, Jen, we're going to hold him to it, and that's it.
I would say our approach is that we can't make projections for the state, right? When we went back and we looked at what happened during the Great Recession and the dot-com bubble, and understanding what that looked like was pretty bad, right? They made 20 to 30% cuts in local aid. Until we get a sense of what the state's doing, it's really hard for us to just make a guess at what's doing, and it's selling ourselves short a little bit, right? We can't sort of make assumptions on what the state's going to cut. Now, while we may expect and
and I'm not expecting you to, but I like to plan, here's best case, worst case, and here's, where we think we're going to land, because I think that just kind of helps being prepared. So obviously we can't predict, no one has a crystal ball, but I'd just be interested if you're thinking about that. I do, and I apologize, I know we are looking at surplus for FY20, Madam Chair, but I'm interested in how this last quarter of FY20 is playing out around I can't help but think about how this last quarter is impacting the first quarter of the next fiscal year. So forgive me if I and keep asking questions along those lines. I'm interested, you mentioned in your presentation, I think, Justin, and I think I'm running out of time, so this will probably be my last one. You mentioned the occupancy rates at hotels and the short-term rentals and the impact that has in terms of our city revenue. Given the need for a cautious rollout in terms of lifting some of the restrictions, and that we still are likely to see, dips in the occupancy rates in those areas for at least part of the first quarter. I just be interested in how we're kind of planning for that and how much we think we lost in this FY20 year and what we think we might lose going into the first quarter of FY21. Thank you so much for your indulgence to all my colleagues and Madam Chairwoman.
Thank you, President Janey. Okay, so.
Oh, I would like an answer to that question. I'm sorry. If you have one, Justin.
Yeah,
I'm happy to wait for a later time, but thank you.
So I can answer just quickly that we don't know for sure. We've heard anecdotally from trade groups that occupancy in hotels is way down March, April, and May. We don't really have a good sense of what the revenue impact was, because that is funding that is paid to the state and then gets sent to us. So we're a month or two behind in when we actually collect that revenue. Looking into 21, we have already, when we submitted the April budget or the mayor's recommended budget back in April, we had already made some assumptions around occupancy that was probably in the neighborhood of 60 to 70% in July. I think that that's an area that we're going to have to revisit as we look at the governor's reopening, and that's going to depend a lot on the public health measures that are available at the time.
Appreciate that. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Okay, so I think everyone has had one round through. I'll just in this round, I'll just ask one question, which is, Justin, if you could just help translate some of that from amounts into dollar amounts into positions, right? So as you're thinking about landing the plane and where there might be surpluses here and there that are going to help cover for unexpected costs elsewhere, does that mean, for example, that some of the staffing up that would have happened in spring and summer for these roles won't happen because we'll need that funding to manage other things? Or can you just talk about in terms of number of people and employees?
Yeah, we're not projecting any layoffs or furloughs, and we do not have any type of hiring freeze on. So anybody who has a budgeted position through the FY is open. Now, I will say it is naturally a little bit slower, and it's naturally a little bit difficult to hire up right now, especially thinking about summer jobs and how to keep people safe and how to keep kids safe. So there is just natural savings that came about through some of those things, but there are no positions that we're either not filling or getting rid of as part of the solve for FY20.
Okay, great. And then, so in terms of, if not intentionally, but has happened, what is that number, or would we be able to get that afterwards, sort of by department?
Yeah, I can certainly look into sort of what I'll call unfilled positions as of right now. There's certainly some, but I don't have that off the top of for this presentation, but we can follow back up.
Okay. Great, thank you. Next round, we'll loop back to Councillor Flaherty, and I just want to everyone to keep in mind that we do have one person signed up for public testimony as of this point. So feel free, if you don't have a question, just to let me know as well, but we'll do one round through and then public testimony. And if councillors still have more questions at that point, we can loop back again. Councillor Flaherty.
Very good. Thank you, Madam Chair. No additional questions. Obviously, this was very helpful to kind of sort of noodle through the thought process of the city's budget office. So that said, just want to remind Justin, obviously, of the council's role as the legislative branch, particularly around the purse strings and making sure that if those decisions are being made by the administration, that they have to run those through the Boston City Council. So other than that, that's just drawing your attention to the charter and our role in municipal government. But nonetheless, I understand things are happening very quickly, and this is a case of first impression, and it's of serious magnitude in terms of the virus and the number of folks that have contracted it, the number of folks, most importantly, who have passed away from it, the communities that have been impacted by it, and obviously our recovery, and making sure that we're taking no neighborhood, no community for granted in those efforts. So that said, just want to make sure that there's a spirit of cooperation and we continue to collaborate on all decisions COVID-19 related, as we've all been elected to make these decisions on behalf of the residents. For my district colleagues, it's people in their district, and for my at-large colleagues, including myself, it's people across the city. So they depend on us to maybe ask the questions and advocate, but at the end of the day, in a situation like this, people want to see partnerships. They want to see collaboration. They want to see us working together, and I'm committed to doing that as a member of the council. And so, as we can facilitate things here in the council, there should be no fretting over, hey, we have an additional surplus here, we have to direct it in this particular area. That's a conversation, and it's a hearing, and it's a vote. We don't have to reinvent the wheel here. So just want to make sure that you and your colleagues know that we're here to work with you guys, and we're on behalf of the residents of the city of Boston. We want to make sure that we're making best efforts, and that those that need these resources, that we have a responsibility to make sure that they get them. So that in a nutshell. I appreciate your attention to detail, Justin, and for your willingness to come forward and just kind of run us through the thought process. So appreciate it, and stay healthy and stay safe. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Councilor Flaherty. Councilor Brandon?
Thank you, Justin. I'm fascinated. I'm learning so much about the city budget through this whole budgeting process, and I really thank you for your attention to detail and thoughtful approach, and your ability to communicate concepts well. You mentioned summer jobs. I was wondering, what's the plan for summer jobs? Like, I know it's really going to be critical this summer, but we don't even know how we're going to do that. But any thoughts or wisdom to share about summer jobs would be value. Thank you.
Yeah, I think I unfortunately I have to defer to my colleagues in YEE and throughout the city about sort of what the plan is, and we can certainly talk about that in the future. I would say from a high level perspective, we heard New York City canceled their summer jobs program, and that is not something that we're pursuing for the city of Boston. We're going to do everything we can to get as many jobs hired as we can, but we're going to be safe about it. We're going to make sure that we're doing it in consistent manner with the public health measures, and we're going to work. And we're going to work with all city departments, our private partners, to try to figure out a way to have a summer jobs program. But I'd have to get back to you on the exact plan for this coming year.
Thank you. That's all I have for now.
Thank you, Councilor Brandon. Councilor Bach?
Thank you, Councilor Wu. Justin, I was wondering if you could just speak to, in terms of like landing the plane, like what your levers are. Because, obviously there's one thing is just monitoring things to know where we're at. But as you get closer into June, still keeping this strictly about FY20, like what actions does the budget office take in a situation like this to make sure that we land where we want to be?
Yeah, there are a ton of actions that we can take. I think the most obvious one we have is when we work with departments to manage their spending towards the end of the year. I think that is something that, if it's a large purchase or if it's a significant number of purchases, that's what we can work with them to say, hey, either this isn't, this is no longer something that we're able to support, or this is something that would be better used next year, and do, could we move the funding? I think that's probably the role and the lever we have to play. I think when it comes to working with our auditing department and working with our, collecting and treasury office, when we sort of understand as funding comes in, depending on whether it's a 20 or 21 expense, we really don't land the plane, quote unquote, until the CAFR, which is the sort of the financial documents we put together for the fall and winter of next year, basically. So we'll spend a lot of time over the next couple months working with our internal A&F partners to, sort of understand when expenses are supposed to hit and when revenue is supposed to be collected, and try to maximize where we think the best opportunity is. A lot can change between June 1st and June 30th and July 1st. So understanding how that works is probably our biggest role we play.
Sorry, the chair told me I was having feedback. So I was wondering, can you speak to, so you talked about the sort of the kind of pots of money that are running over or down. What you didn't talk about as much was kind of departments that are running ahead of or behind pace. And we have some sense of that as a council in a disaggregated way based on the spreadsheets that you're sending over to us. So we can kind of see, right, like Do It only has 15% of its budget left as of March 31st, whereas for, I think, OED is 36%, right? So there's, And obviously we know that for some departments that reflects being really ahead of or behind pace. And for some departments that reflects lumpiness around when they're paying different contracts. And I just wonder if you could speak to any departments, precisely because, as you said, you wouldn't transfer money between departments without, circling in with the council, et cetera. Like if you could speak to departments that were kind of like predicting to be over or under based on their pace right now.
I think that's a fair question. I don't have a sort of a direct answer for you. I think police and fire and public works, trash and recycling are certainly the three areas that I would imagine are going to end the year in deficit. Public works, we'll see how things go with some of their other surpluses that they may have within their own department. But I would certainly say police and fire are the two that are most likely going to end the year in a total deficit. I think we're going to work with departments to, whether it's OED or do it to either manage to their budget number or make sure they're expending it like OED if OED is behind. Not that I have their numbers in front of me either. So I think that's really a management with the departments as opposed to sort of stopping them or spending other money. It's just a process of staying in contact with them on what are some of the expenses and costs that they have coming up.
Okay, great. Thanks. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Bach. Councillor Mejia?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Councillor Flaherty, for hosting this, and Justin for being so thorough. I really don't have any additional questions. Just wanted to say thank you. If I have any questions, I will follow up via email.
Notify me.
I think you did a great job. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor.
Thank you, Councillor Mejia. Councillor Campbell? Oh, I think she may have stepped away. So President Janey.
Thank you so much. No additional questions for me either. Just wanted to say thank you again, Justin, for all of your work. I know it must be a little crazy right now as we're closing out the end of the fiscal year during a global pandemic and trying to predict what we need moving forward. So certainly appreciate the work that you're putting in and look forward to continuing this process through our Ways and Means Committee as well as our Post-Audit Committee, and want to thank the maker as well as the chair for a great hearing. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Happy birthday.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Justin. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Press. Okay, so we'll go to public testimony at this point, and our friend Frank O'Brien is on. It looks like Frank is the only person signed up right now. So as a reminder to everyone, you can always email us your public testimony afterwards and in future coordinate so that we can add you to our hearings as well. But Frank, if you could take about 2 minutes and introduce yourself and state your name and address for the record, and then feel free to comment. Thank you.
Sure. Good afternoon, everybody. Frank O'Brien. The address is 43 Mendham Street in Roslindale. And I want to follow up a thread of discussion that came on the Environmental Department hearing. And I have three questions. Although first, if it is Council President Janey's birthday, happy birthday for sure.
Thank you, sir.
No, not at all.
Good weekend. Thank you.
Getting better. The three questions I had that follow up from the thread from the Environment Department was, number one, it seemed as if the Environment Department did have a surplus. And from what I understood from Justin's presentation, under certain circumstances, if there's a surplus give back, that makes funding ineligible for a federal component. I just wanted to confirm if that's the case for the Environment Department. Certainly in terms of environment surplus, we're very much in favor of having that surplus go into our common effort to address the health crisis. The other two questions have to do with the go forward for FY 21, and in making assessments as to sort of what the emphasis is going to be in terms of retaining line items or adding line items, and specifically in terms of the climate reserve fund that's been proposed. Does the administration look into criteria of whether line items are eligible for matching funds from other sources, the catalytic benefit of if you invest a little bit, you can get a match. And then the second is the criteria of, as been mentioned, the role of community input and community engagement. One of the things that we're advocating with the Climate Fund is that it be ineligible for community-based applications for spend, whether it's along American Legion, Blue Hill Avenue, or over in East Boston, for example. So those are the three questions, and I'll sign off and just listen to the answer. Thanks all, appreciate it.
Thank you, Frank. Justin?
Hey, how are you? I will try to take those in reverse order. So the Climate Resiliency Fund that we set up in this year's capital plan is sort of separate than the operating budget. We are sort of still evaluating criteria of how we're going to use that funding. The desire of the funding is to supplement existing city capital projects to make them more climate resilient. I think a great example of the nexus of this project and where sort of it came from was the L Street Bath at the Curley Community Center, and the notion that we never want to sacrifice programmatic efforts or resiliency efforts. So this would be a pot of funding where we can sort of identify sort of climate resilience aspects of capital projects that are in the capital plan. We certainly do spend a lot of time leveraging federal resources. The capital plan is a $3 billion plan, of which about $2 billion is from the city and about $1 billion comes from other state and federal and other resources. I think the best example of that would be last year's capital plan included $10 million for the Fort Point Channel, which was a match to a $10 million FEMA climate resiliency grant for another $10 million. So we certainly, we do spend a lot of time thinking about private resources. As far as the federal overlap, that is strictly a coronavirus fund related aspect. So part of the criteria for the coronavirus fund is that it can't be budgeted. And when we transfer funding from one department to another, it becomes budgeted in that other department. So that would make it an ineligible cost for this specific coronavirus relief fund. So that is what that was referencing to, not other general federal funding resources. And I think that was all three.
Great. Thank you so much. That concludes public testimony. And I think most of my colleagues have waived their closing statement. So we'll go to the sponsor of this docket, Councilor Michael Flaherty, for a final word. Oh, in the world of Zoom, I may have time.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
You good,
sorry,
Michael?
Madam Chair. A little technical difficulty. The cursor was not moving with the finger. No really final comments other than I appreciate you taking the time to have the hearing. First and foremost, my colleagues from joining. Obviously, it's a serious enough issue. Again, on the repositioning, the repurposing, if there's funds available, if we have departments running a surplus, we need to have a conversation with the city council as to where we want to direct those. We all have shared responsibilities and shared priorities in order to make sure that the funds are getting to people that need them the most, particularly our front line and our first responders, starting with those. And then obviously identify where the federal funds could be helpful as well. So you have your hands full, Justin. We appreciate your time and attention to today's hearing and look forward to continued partnership with you. And thank you, Madam Chair, for the hearing.
Thank you, Councilor Flaherty, and thank you to all my colleagues. Thank you especially to central staff for taking this on, and to Justin for your time amidst everything else that you're working with us on. So we're so grateful for you. This will conclude the Post-Audit and Oversight Committee's hearing on docket number 0621, order for a hearing regarding all City Department FY20 budget surpluses. This hearing is adjourned.
Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you. Okay, bye everyone. Have a good day.
Awesome. Well,